Hello again, it's Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back with our next lesson, and I'll have to confess, I've taught the Old Testament, I think, 3 times prior to this, and this is the first time I'm going to teach Ezekiel. I skipped it the other 3 times because it's an extremely difficult book to understand, and it's just as difficult to understand it now as it was those years ago, and I'm going to do the best I can. Presentation may be a bit different because there's going to be a lot more conjecture in here. And a lot of opinion. So, is it okay for you all to disagree with my opinion? You bet. I'd actually like to hear from a few of you. What do you think about the lesson? Did I make sense? Is my hypothesis as to where this came from and why this is still in the scripture? Is that a reasonable hypothesis? Is the medical term for a guess? Excuse me, scientific term for a guess. So this is my guesstimate at what this book is all about because it's totally different. It's very difficult. Like I said, I haven't taught it before. I skipped it in the previous classes. Now, who was this guy? Well, Ezekiel, there's very little about him because the other thing to realize is the historical books, 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, have stopped at this point with the exile. There is a little bit of historical writing later, which are Ezra and Nehemiah, which were originally one scroll about the return from Babylon to rebuild in Jerusalem over a 40 or 50 year period. But the historical books have pretty much stopped. So there's no historical information about Ezekiel. A little bit in his book that he appears to have come from a Jerusalem priestly family. He has priestly ties way back. Remember, the priesthood was in many ways hereditary inside the old Levi family. He appears to have come from that. He was taken out in the first exile. The first exile was 597 BC. Remember, there were 2 separate exiles. They linked together. They captured Jerusalem twice and took out various people for exile. Basically, the second time, almost, but not quite, cleaning Jerusalem out. He was in the first group. This was the most elite group. The king, most of the royal family, the nobility, the elite families, the great merchants, all the skilled artisans, everybody of value, they took out. And he was in that group. But we don't know any more about him. About that point, we know a little bit from his text that he started this prophecy book about 5 years later. And it went off and on for 27 years. And that's all we know. We don't know when he died, how he died, whatever happened to him. We don't know in historical. Did they like him? Did they treat him well? Did they lock him up? Did they honor him? No idea. And so you have to, like I said, the historical record is over, and we don't have that anymore. From what little we know about the exile in Babylonia, even though the Babylonians were a nasty, nasty bunch and their own people hated them, the Jewish community appears to be, Hebrew community is a better term for it, appears to have been taken as a group and then a second group and settled probably amongst themselves along a riverbank in the Babylon area and pretty much left to their own resources. Now this group is different. The northern kingdom of Israel was taken into exile by the Assyrians in 721 and they disappeared into Assyrian culture. My hypothesis, guess, is their problem was they really didn't have a strong monotheistic faith. They were a mix. They are all corrupted, and they never got the corruption under control. Their government was in chaos. They were killing people each other all the time. And they didn't have a strong base, and they just disappeared into Assyrian culture. Many ethnic groups come here to the United States and pretty much disappear into our culture. A few of them with strong ethnic religious ties have held themselves together. The Greeks and the Greek church. I know an Egyptian immigrant family that is a Christian Egyptian family, and they're oriented through their church. So a strong religious basis will keep many groups together, even when they've moved immigrant into a different culture. So this group it actually becomes a blessing. They bond together. They take their disparate information and they compile it together. They put the historical books together, they put the prophetic books together, and they even develop an emerging theology, which we'll do later in the next time. But this is the first of these writers. And this is Ezekiel, and he does this. Now, this is an odd book. I'm going to probably do the best I can. And like I said, I'd love to hear from you. You don't like the presentation, write me an email, let me know. Ezekiel, he gets a divine call about 5 years in. It's not clear how this divine call comes, and it goes off and on for 27 years, as I said before. This is where you really get strange. There's no historical background. There's no biographical background. There's no scriptural references in what he said. And what happens, it's full of a very strange imagery that he reports a number of visions in which he envisions these great events, or he has a fiery chariot come down and summon him up to the heavenly host. He sees a new Jerusalem rebuilt in all its glory, and he sees all these visions that he sees, not that he hears. And so it's extremely confusing. I ducked it for a number of reasons because I didn't really know how to explain this. So when I was doing my studying for this, it turns out that the scholarly community is just as confused by this guy as I am. Okay? And they don't know what to make of this either. And so it's difficult to interpret. What about these visions? Now, let me explain things. This is not a sign of mental illness or anything like that. When people have schizophrenia, craziness, they don't see things. They hear voices that tell them to do strange things or weird things or sometimes dangerous things. But they're hearing voices that aren't there. And you don't have visions of things you see in the absence of some kind of mental brain dysfunction, not mental illness, brain dysfunction. People in alcohol withdrawals, DTs, some of them will see, creatures crawling on them and all that. I've never been there. I have never, I've heard that people that have amphetamine overdoses, we used to have a lot of speed floating around when I was young, and would see things, car crashes and stuff that weren't there and all this, and they would see creatures on them and all that. And apparently the hallucinogenic drugs, mescaline and peyote and LSD and all that, has different types of vision. I've never done any of this stuff. I've been pretty much a straight and narrow kind of guy. In reading about those, they see more strange shapes and colors and all that. They don't see things like this. So is it possible he got a hold of a hallucinogen? Yeah, I doubt it. There are natural hallucinogens. Peyote and mescaline grows out in the American Southwest. They may be natural growing hallucinogens in the Middle East. There's no reports of it. I don't think that's it. Okay? And it's reassuring that the scholarly community doesn't have any explanation as to how he sees these visions either. They just don't know. So I think he just felt this. He conceived this, probably more from internally rather than actually visualizing it. And he felt this was a divine message to him. And that's my only explanation for it. He claims that he had seen these things by divine intervention, but he's, like I said, it's not clear how he sees them or how he perceives them. He doesn't claim that these were dreams. That's one way you can see strange things. And again, we don't have any of these other interpretations. So my interpretation of it, and this is just opinion, let's be very clear here, is that he just felt these things. Imagined is probably a good term. And he imagined a rebuilt Jerusalem. He imagined a great fiery chariot. He imagined these things and communicated them, wrote them down. That's my, is this inspired imagery? I think so. But it fills a very interesting transition in the Hebrew writings. And this is where I'm really getting into opinion here. This is just creative on my part. That what's the purpose of having this strange, unexplainable book in the Old Testament? And it's in both of the canons. It's not a one that you debate about. There's some ones that are not in the Jewish canon, but are in the Catholic canon from the Septuagint and Tobit and Judith and things like that. It's not. It's in both. And I think you have to understand it's really a huge transition. the previous prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah and all these people, were at a time where there were Hebrew kingdoms, one or two, and they were saying to the king, princes, the nobility, shape up. You're corrupting this religion. God brought you here and gave you this kingdom and all this, and you're corrupting it. You've got idols in the temple. You're worshiping Baal and Ashtart and all this other stuff. You're even doing child sacrifice. The whole thing was shape up or God's going to punish you and take your kingdoms away. Well, by the time you get to Ezekiel, the kingdoms are gone. Okay, and they really don't come back. There was a brief Hebrew kingdom during after the Maccabean rebellion, but it very quickly became a corrupt Oriental. I bet that's my former pastor again, communicating with me. Nope, somebody else. At least I have more than one friend. and so the kingdoms are gone, and they're not going to come back. So this is a transition book between when the prophecy is about functioning here on earth and not being corrupt and obeying God, or God's going to punish you. The kingdoms are gone and they're not coming back. So you suddenly see issue dealing with more heavenly, divine, or long-term issues of faith and belief, rather than do it right and you're going to be rewarded. If you're not do it right, you're going to be punished. And so you're into what's now known as and you see these literatures begin to appear. They begin to talk about the end of times, and they begin to talk about a variety of things. So what the prophetic literature does is it changes, because it becomes more writings, more creative. Certain things are not historical. They claim to be. Jonah is my favorite character in the Old Testament, but it's not a historical writing. Esther is a great story, but it's not a historical writing. Those things didn't happen. They were written down. And does the Bible allow God to use creative writings, literature, to make a point? Sure. Why not? We don't really know whether the Good Samaritan story actually happened or whether Jesus was telling a story of great power and great meaning. I think the second thing. So this is a transition book. It's where you're getting into a situation where the priority moves from maintaining the kingdom, which is now gone and ain't coming back, into preparing for the end of times, either personally or for the end of times overall. And so you find that these dramatic prophecies in Ezekiel, and they're followed by Daniel, have the same types of end of time prophecies. And then in the non-canonical Jewish books between Daniel, which is probably the last book of the Old Testament, about 300 BC, through the time of Jesus, there are a series of things called the Pseudo-Figura, small writings, and a lot of those are dealing with this same type of imagery of the end is coming and this is how it's going to end and you're going to do this. And you got to remember that previous Hebrew thought did not have a heavenly reward. Your reward was on earth, and when you died, you went down to wherever, the holding area, like the old Greek Hades, and they summoned Samuel back from there, but he wasn't in heaven. He was in the underworld. Into where they're looking at a heavenly reward type. There's a very transitional period here. And so these writings have two different fancy terms for them. And one of the terms is eschatology. Eschatology deals with the end of time. The end of time. Now, Jesus actually talks a lot eschatologically on a personal basis. The end of your time. The end of my time, when I will move on to my heavenly reward or punishment. Jesus talked about punishment too. And so the eschatology is with the end of time, and time will end. I just looked up how long do they expect the earth to last? Somewhere between 1 billion and 5 billion years before the sun enlarges and burns us up. Well, that's really not a worry to me. There'll be no memory of any of us at that time. And so that's what they're beginning to deal with here is the end of time, which will come for all of us. The other one is called apocalyptic. And apocalyptic, of course, is this huge battle between the forces of evil, whether it's Satan or the 999s or these other things, and the forces of good, whether it's Jesus or God or the mixture of these things. And excuse me while I laugh at the text messages I'm getting. And these are sometimes mixed together, but this type of literature becomes very prominent between Ezekiel and even into the late New Testament period, because the Revelation of John is apocalyptic literature. It's eschatological because it's the end of time, yes, but it's also apocalyptic because there's this huge battle and there are a lot of dead people and everybody gets killed. There's actually several other Christian apocalyptic books written that didn't make it into the New Testament, thank goodness. Okay, I would have left Revelation out if they'd left it up to me, but it wasn't up to me. And so this is the first of this transition as everything becomes different. And you'll find that the writings will get differently. I have the Jewish pseudo-figure writings. I haven't studied them, but a lot of them deal with these same issues. And there's a lot of other issues that prop up that we will study between now and when we finish. Why do bad things happen to good people? That's part of Job, which is a very fundamental thing, because the old formula, which is the Deuteronomic formula, that if you do good, everything's going to be fine, and if you do bad, you're going to get punished, that doesn't work. Because it doesn't work that way in life. So you really have to deal with these other issues. You have faith just for its own sake, which was my favorite thing about Habakkuk, which we covered a couple weeks ago. So everything's changing, and we're into these other types of things, and it's going to be very different. I'll do the best I can. I'm not a person of great image or this type of thing. But those are the two words are eschatological, which is the end of time, which can be very personal. I wish he'd stop. And apocalyptic, which is also an end of time, but you get this huge battle. Jesus' eschatology is much more personal. Make your relationship with your God, believe, redemption, etc. Go on to your heavenly reward or to your punishment. But he doesn't predict this end of huge battle. That's really in Revelation and the other apocalyptic literature. So that's how I see Ezekiel. It's an awkward book. It's very difficult. Nobody really can explain it. I can't explain it any more than that. But I do think it fits in as a transition literature, preparing us to move toward the issues that are much more prominent 600 years later when Jesus walks the earth and tries to explain the meaning of life and the meaning of faith to us in our own stupidity and our ignorance and our foolishness. So that's my read. Like I said, if you didn't like this, please let me know. I do the best I can, and this is all opinion. This is not fact, and it's okay to critique me. Now, next week we're going to deal a different thing with the thing that really, the Babylonian exile was a very positive experience. You don't think it would be, but it is, because it blends them together as a community. They get their writings intact. They put together their creation stories, the first 11 chapters of Genesis. They compile the Deuteronomic histories. They compile the prophetic books that we've talked about beforehand, and they suddenly change their theology. So we're going to deal with these questions over the next couple weeks, and then we'll go through and finish up, probably because we're going to take time off for each of the holidays. Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's are all weekend holidays. We're not going to tape them. And we'll get done about end of January is my guess. But we're heading into different times. So the reading for next week, if you want to read it, are the first 11 chapters of Genesis. This is the creation story. This is an attempt to explain the unexplainable. And I think you have to approach it that way. This is their attempt from a relatively primitive society that thinks they have an Earth-centric universe where everything revolves around the Earth rather than we revolve around this modest star in a modest-sized galaxy where there's hundreds of billions of galaxies out there. And they're trying to explain the unexplainable, which is the creation of life and our existence therein. So that's the first 11 chapters of Genesis. It's a fun read. After that, down the road, we'll deal with 2nd Isaiah, which is the most important part of the Old Testament, in my opinion, which is the prophecies of the Messiah, the explanation of the suffering servant, and then we'll finish up the rest of them. And I'll do the best I can. It's a much less of a formed thing, and I'm going to have to wing it, but I'm good at that. This is Dr. Guthrie. See you next week, first 11 chapters of Genesis.